In this video I'm making a round coffee table out of Queensland Maple. Made this table for our friends Bambi and Graham, which is really good because you get to visit the table and use it, and we have shared a few margaritas over this table. Queensland Maple is a fantastic timber to work with and comes up really well when finished. I made the table about 3 years ago and didn't record all the build, so in this video there's a few more still shots than you'd normally get in my videos. So wherever you are, take a well-deserved break for 10 minutes, sit back, relax and enjoy my new video. I started off with 5 planks of Queensland Maple. They're roughly around 230mm wide and 50mm thick. A little thicker than I wanted, so I will be stripping them down to thickness. This coffee table top will be round and it will be around 1 metre in diameter. My son Mason dropped in and had a go at planing the top flat, but we ended up throwing it through the thicknesser. I'm only planing one side smooth because I still need to rip them down to about 38mm in thickness. One board was too twisted to run through the planer thicknesser, so I added a wedge of timber on it to compensate for the twist. This allowed me to run it through and get one side flat. I used a homemade sled on the table saw to give me a perfectly straight edge on each plank. After getting the edges of the boards straight and true, it was time to thickness them down to 32mm, which was my target for the tabletop. With the table saw blade at almost full extension, I'm cutting a 32mm cut up into the side of the board. This will be repeated on the other side as well. The table saw didn't quite make it all the way through, even though I cut on both sides. So here I'm completing the cut on the bandsaw. The 20-inch bandsaw has a tungsten tip blade and makes light work of cuts like this. I already have a project in mind for the offcuts. It'll be bent laminated rails for a coffee table. I joined the tabletop boards together with dominoes. You can see the shape of the table traced on this board, and I took a lot of care to make sure the dominoes wouldn't protrude through the side of the table edge. Something therapeutic about hammering dominoes into holes. It's just mind-numbingly simple. Makes for a good video as well. I glued up the tabletop in 2 halves so that it would fit through my drum sander, but I didn't capture the clamping up at the table. As I pointed out before, it's always a good idea to think about the final shape of your tabletop and where you position your dominoes. You don't want these little suckers coming out the edge of the table. Here I'm imparting a little bit of wisdom and running half of the tabletop through the drum sander. There may not be a lot of sand in sandpaper these days, but there was plenty of sand at Town Beach. But not a lot of waves. The swell was only about 1 foot, so off to the workshop I go. Here I'm doing a little bit of fine tuning with the hand plane to make sure that the 2 edges of the tabletop halves joined together perfectly. Once again, no video to glue up or clamp up with the two halves, but it did happen. I like to factory test everything I make, and what better way to factory test a coffee table than with a coffee and chocolate mud cake. You heard it, chocolate mud cake. Made you hungry, didn't I? Cut the final shape of the coffee table on the bandsaw. To get a perfect circle, I found the centre of the board, put a pin in it, dropped the pin into a hole in the table and spun it around, and the bandsaw took care of the rest. Let me see if I can make sanding interesting. No, even upside down, it's still boring. No one wants to see it. The customer gave me this massive paintbrush, which used to belong to her father, so I used it to remove the dust from the table before I gave it a coat of lacquer. After sanding, I sealed the table with a brushed coat of polyurethane. I ended up putting 2 coats on, really made the grain pop. Then sanded it back a little and gave it a spray coat of polyurethane, which gave it a nice matte finish in the end. Where the legs meet the bottom cross brace, there's 12mm finger joints. Here I'm cutting the finger joints on a homemade sled on the table saw. This sled was really just thrown together. I had a piece of 6mm threaded rod, and the thread was 1mm in pitch, which meant every time I turned the spanner a full turn, the workpiece moved across 1mm. After completing one part of the finger joint, I laid it up next to the corresponding part of timber and marked out which part would be waste and which part will be kept. Then it was back to the table saw where I cut out the corresponding finger joints by eye instead of number of turns. The customer's partner dropped in and couldn't help himself but get involved in the project, so he grabbed a tape measure, put it on a bit of wood and struck his best mad scientist pose. The 2 leg components were joined by a half lap on the bottom cross section. Here I'm just hogging out the half lap on the table saw. And the tick of approval, a smiley face when you know the half lap is ready to glue up. A quick test clamp up to make sure all the components will go together easily before I add the glue. I glued up the finger joints first and left them overnight before I glued up the half lap. Here I'm cutting the rabbet or the rebate in the cross section that attaches to the underneath of the table. I've always wondered why they called it rabbet, but when I checked Wikipedia, rabbet and rebate can be swapped out, depending which country you live in. Here I am cleaning up the rabbet with a chisel, and I do enjoy the sound of a chisel going through timber. Finally you get to see the leg structure and how all the components come together. The two leg frames aren't glued at the cross bracing yet, but I did check that everything fitted and it's ready for glue up. A little bit of tight bond glue, a couple of clamps, and I left it overnight to dry. Prior to this, what you didn't see, I used a 1/8 round over bit in the router and took off all the sharp edges on the leg components. I screwed the top part of the leg structure together because this part won't be seen. And as you can see, I use slots instead of holes to allow for timber movement in the tabletop. Bolts will go through the slots and attach to threaded inserts in the tabletop. After tightening the bolts down, I did back them off about a quarter of a turn. This allows for timber expansion or contraction. Here's some finished pictures of the table. It was a simple design, and I guess the hardest part was the finger joints, but that did include making the jig on the fly. I do like the simple round design, curve over on the top. Customer was pretty happy, and we have enjoyed a few margaritas on it over the years. Hope you enjoyed watching this video, and keep a lookout for what I do with the offcuts of the tabletop. I'm thinking curved lamination hall table. Time will tell. It's still in the design phase in my mind.